Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Shorenstein-Barone Center on Press and Politics here at the Kennedy School, and I welcome you to this Theodore H. White lecture for 1991. I see many familiar faces out here, people who have been here for the last couple of years at the White lecture. I'm delighted that you're all back. This introduction focuses on one man, but it's really a tale about three men. All men of Harvard, all friends, all journalists, all linked to the speech we will hear tonight. One is Theodore H. White, in whose name this lecture series on press and politics was founded 2 years ago, a writer of extraordinary accomplishment, whether his subject be China, Europe, or the American presidency. Another is Blair Clark, without whose tireless efforts this series would have remained only an item on my wish list for the Shorenstein-Barone Center, my colleague and boss at CBS News many years ago, when Tiffany was the word used to describe that network. No longer. The third man is Benjamin Bradley. Ben to his friends, Jason Robards to his fans. When Watergate was a political scandal so immense it became a movie, and to students of press and politics, an editor of exceptional achievement, whose leadership of the Washington Post for 26 years, from 1965 to 1991, transformed a sleepy southern newspaper, which happened to be located in the nation's capital, into one of the 2 or 3 best newspapers in the country and perhaps in the world. While preparing these remarks, I took Bradley's Conversations with Kennedy out of Widener and discovered, much to my surprise, that I had stumbled upon a very special copy. It was as if chance were confirming the correctness of Bradley delivering the White lecture tonight. The book turned out to be a gift from the White estate to Harvard, and it contained a neat handwritten inscription to White. For Teddy White, it read, with whom conversations over the years have been joyous, instructive, warm, and graceful, and whose friendship and example have been so meaningful to me. Signed, Ben Bradley, May 1975. In the book, President John Kennedy is quoted as saying, "What makes journalism so fascinating and biography so interesting is the struggle to answer that single question, what's he like?" White was a scholarship student here at Harvard in the Depression years of the 1930s, inspired by John Fairbank to study China, a self-described meatball from Boston, with no blue blood to open a single door, but with a driving ambition to learn, to report, and to write about a world in turmoil. Ben Bradley, what's he like? Though he and White shared so much, they emerged from totally different backgrounds. If for White, Harvard in the 30s was an open sesame to respectability and a job, for Bradley, Harvard was part of the natural progression of life. From St. Mark's, the sons of the Boston establishment went on to Harvard, just as Bradley's father had done, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather. Ben was, to use Teddy White's words, as traditional as the sacred cod that hangs from the balcony of Bullfinch's Beacon Hill State House. At Harvard, he comped for the Crimson, instigated by another alumnus of St. Mark's, Blair Clark. But though Clark became president of the newspaper, Bradley, as a freshman, so rarely attended classes, he was put on disciplinary probation, ending his courtship of the Crimson. His one consolation was that a few other famous journalists, Walter Lippmann and Haywood Broom, for example, didn't make it either. Then, in December 1941, almost 50 years ago, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and Bradley changed his attitude toward attending classes and much else. "It's not like polio, it's not like your old man going broke," Bradley explained. "This is overpowering. It was the experience of my youth." He took extra courses, studied hard, and set his sights on the U.S. Navy. In one short week in June 1942, Bradley was graduated from Harvard, won a commission in the Navy, and got married. At the age of 20, Bradley, like hundreds of thousands of other young Americans, went off to war. 4 years in the Pacific, destroyers, battle action, decorations. I got to tell you, he disclosed not too long ago, I loved it. In September 1946, Bradley got his first taste of journalism on the New Hampshire Sunday News. He couldn't get enough of it. Blair Clark was publisher, and Bradley became a star investigative reporter, filing one expose after another until one state official was sent to jail and Senator Stiles Bridges was almost nailed as a crook. In 1948, Bradley went off to Washington, where he became an $80 a week police reporter at the Washington Post. 3 years later, he quit, restless and frustrated. In those days, the Post was a very somnolent place. A friend suggested a job as press attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. He accepted. After all, he said, he did speak French. It was a riotous time of anti-American demonstrations and long liquid lunches with diplomats, politicians, and journalists. Bradley met Teddy White, Art Buchwald, and many others. His friend Blair Clark resurfaced as a CBS News correspondent. An irony of ironies, Arnaud de Beaugrave, who was many years later to become Bradley's nemesis as editor of the competing Washington Times, admiring his dash and his connections, offered him the job of Paris correspondent of Newsweek, a job Bradley took and loved until he was transferred to Washington a few years later. The rest of the story is more familiar. Bradley met the junior senator from Massachusetts, who also lived in Georgetown and who had clear ambitions for the presidency. They became close friends. Problem: Bradley covered Kennedy as a senator, presidential candidate, and as president. Newsweek benefited mightily. One exclusive after another flowed from this relationship. Years later, there were questions. Did Bradley know about Kennedy's alleged womanizing? And if he did, would he have written about it? The answers to those questions are no and yes. If I had covered up for him because of our friendship, Bradley said recently, that would have been an unforgivable sin. I sure would have pursued the story that the president shared a mistress with a gangster. That's a betrayal of office. I find it stunning even now. In 1961, Bradley's closeness to Kennedy notwithstanding, Newsweek ran into severe economic difficulty. The Astor Foundation was planning to sell the magazine. Bradley knew the Astors and Philip Graham, then publisher of the Washington Post. One call and meeting led to another until the Post bought Newsweek and Bradley was catapulted into the job of Newsweek bureau chief. 2 years later, Philip Graham committed suicide, Kennedy was assassinated, and Katharine Graham succeeded her husband as publisher of the Post. By 1965, it was clear to Mrs. Graham and others that the paper needed new leadership, an infusion of energy, experience, toughness, panache. She was prepared to spend money. She needed a managing editor, and it was no secret then that Bradley wanted the job. She offered it, he took it, and the Post began a dizzying climb from one pinnacle to another until now it is widely recognized as a great American newspaper. Vietnam, the riots in Washington, Nixon, the Pentagon Papers in Watergate, Woodward and Bernstein, the Iran hostage crisis, recession and Reagan, the scandal called Iran-Contra, these were all stories the Post covered with distinction, courage, and style. With Bradley at the helm, the Post doubled its staff from 300 to 600. Its news budget increased from $3 million to $60 million. Circulation rose from 446,000 to 802,000. The paper won 23 Pulitzer Prizes. To return to President Kennedy's question, what was he like? In the newsroom, he had no specific strategy, I'm told, the kind the Kennedy School so adores. He just loved a good story, well-written and vibrant, and he cultivated what might be called creative tension, pitting one young reporter against another. What was Bradley's definition of a newspaper? He has always enjoyed quoting Philip Graham. It's the first rough draft of history. Bradley believes that one day the truth will emerge, but it doesn't spring from a daily headline. If you weren't scared of being lynched, he said, you would tell these readers of these newspapers that this isn't the truth. It's the beginning of the truth. It's the first bite. Bradley also believes that race is the biggest story in the country, that he had no hesitation in 1971 publishing the Pentagon Papers, but in 1985 refused to publish a national security story called Operation Ivy Bells, because he thought the official who leaked it to Bob Woodward was being unpatriotic. And that, as we shall soon hear, lying in Washington, whether in the White House or the Congress, is wrong, immoral, tearing at the fiber of our national instincts and institutions, and must stop. Stephen Isaacs, the former Post editor and now an associate dean at the Columbia School of Journalism, went looking for the right words to describe Ben Bradley, and he came up with these. He's one of the most fabulous men I've ever known. It's a physical thing. He exudes animal sexuality. And he uses it on men, women, boys, and girls, everybody. You have all been warned. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Ben Bradley.
I think that tells you a lot more about Steve Isaacs than it does about me, but President Rudenstein, Beatty, all of you friends, there's something very intimidating about a memorial lecture. The trappings of engraved invitations, distinguished guests, plus the knowledge that one's remarks will be published. Are your remarks going to be published in that? And maybe even taught, combine in the case at hand to put a formidable distance between the scholarly achievements of Theodore H. White, playwright, novelist, historian, and the infectious warmth of Teddy White, all-time, all-pro political junkie. Back in the early 50s in Paris, Teddy wasn't awesome at all. Even though he was a recognized China expert, he'd run afoul of Henry Luce, and like the rest of us, was scratching a living out of the wonder of Europe being reborn. Paris was a glorious place to be an American journalist at that time. $9,000 a year for me, and I bet you Teddy didn't make that. It was inexpensive, beautiful as only that sensual city can be, filled with political crises, wars of independence, and the international conferences that we journalists love, plus Peter Townsend, Grace Kelly, and Brigitte Bardot. Until the infamous terroristic ride through Western Europe of Joe McCarthy's hatchet men, Cone and Shine. Their specialty that spring season was choking the life out of the Foreign Service, and their subspecialty was banning books in USIA libraries. One of the books they banned, of course, was Thunder Out of China by Teddy and Annalee Jacoby. To make matters as bad as they possibly could be, news of the banning made page one of the New York Times just a few days before the Book of the Month Club met to consider Teddy's latest book, Fire in the Ashes. Everyone agreed they wouldn't take fire if thunder was still on McCarthy's odious index. Teddy would stay broke, and we'd all still be there, sitting in those sidewalk cafes. But Douglas Dillon, who may still be an overseer of this college, was ambassador to France at that time, ruined that prospect with a really strong, brave, eyes-only cable to Secretary of State Dulles, noting the absurdity and the cowardice of banning a book by an author who had been investigated and accredited by Eisenhower, Harriman, Gunther, Neustadt, Jean Monnet, David Bruce, and virtually every other establishment figure in post-war Europe. Thunder Out of China was unbanned, and Fire in the Ashes was selected as Book of the Month. Teddy and the rest of us got our revenge on Cone and Shine a few weeks later at one of the weirdest press conferences ever held. Cohn and Shine had been persuaded and somehow had agreed to speak to the press, not knowing that 50 or 60 reporters were quite literally laying in wait for them, led by the Brits, who were wonderfully outraged by Cohn's expressed intent to investigate the BBC. Better investigate the royal family, they thought. Anyway, the first question, it was held on a Sunday afternoon. The first question at this press conference was, "How the hell old are you, Shine?" The last question was, "Could you possibly be happy in your work?" All in all, one of the most delightful and oddly effective press conferences ever held. And Teddy just sat there in silence with his Buddha-like smile. 2 years ago, I called it a Jewish Buddha-like smile, hardly concealing the pleasure we all took in the spectacle of Cohn and Shine self-destructing in front of our very eyes. For the historians among you, you should know that this was one of the very first electronically recorded press conferences ever held, or at least I thought it was. Art Buchwald had bought one of those newfangled Dick Tracy wristwatch microphones, and with a wire running from the watch up his sleeve, around his neck, into something that was stuffed in here. "Don't worry," he told all of us journalists there, "I'm taping the whole thing." And he sat there in the front row with his hand sort of like that, and whenever he was about to be recognized, he'd go like this. After it was all over, we adjourned to the Creon bar. Buchwald had to get half undressed to free the new gadget. And finally he was ready. We all felt silent. He turned the machine on. Absolutely not a sound. And we sat there. The rest of the people in the bar thought we were crazy as we just poured over this machine going, Luckily for the good guys, no one had trusted Art enough to take no notes, and history was served by those whose notes produced page-one stories all over. Teddy had come to Paris to work for the Overseas News Agency, ONA, the old Jewish telegraph agency, where he had succeeded his friend David Schonbrun. He quit ONA for an uneasy alliance with Max Astley and the Reporter magazine, followed by a tour with Collier's, and finally back to the US of A to begin work on the making of the president. There was a novel in there, too. That book changed presidential politics forever, for all of us here in this room, and forever. It changed those politics forever because it changed the vital relationship between the press and the presidency forever. Teddy and his book coincided with a full flowering of television, and together they raised journalism so many notches, almost up to the level of history. If we had been writing the first rough draft of history as reporters for daily newspapers, Teddy was writing history. If we had come a long way from the front page and a long way from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's White House press corps, which consisted of 11 men and May Craig of the Portland Press Herald, we had not yet achieved the respectability and authority that access to detail and anecdote produced when mixed with a knowledge of politics. Overnight, publication of The Making of the President, 1960, gave us that respectability and authority. The key to the book's access, of course, was access, unparalleled access. John F. Kennedy was the first American president to really like newspapers, and he really liked Teddy White. Kennedy was the first American president to sense what an ideal relationship between the press and the presidency might be, and he was particularly respectful of history and his own role in it. Richard Nixon was forced to give Teddy equal access in self-defense. He did not really like reporters, and he didn't particularly like Teddy. But he, too, valued history and his place therein. That's why he taped everything, isn't it? Both candidates gave White the access that reporters dream about, and with that access, he wrote the book that set the standards by which all subsequent campaign books have been judged. Access, of course, is a mixed blessing. It gives the reporter opportunities to delve deeper and deeper in search of truth, and it gives those who are accessed opportunities to manipulate that truth, a little or a lot or beyond all recognition. Teddy White made reporters feel that they needed this super access to do their job. They needed a seat in the convention hall command center. They needed unlimited time alone with the wife, the children, the close advisors. And politicians got the message. They began to give selected reporters that kind of super access, and the great manipulation madness was underway. None of this is thunderously original. In the sayings of the Jewish fathers, there is this wonderful advice to journalists: love work, hate domination, and don't get too close to the ruling class. The great Walter Lippmann gave me the same advice 2,000 years later when he learned of my friendship with Jack Kennedy. And yet Lippmann's cocktail parties for Washington's power establishment were legendary. And he received Jack Kennedy in his house only days after Kennedy was elected. My thesis tonight is not that access breeds manipulation, although it damn well can. My thesis is that the manipulators have gone way beyond the granting of access or the withholding of access in their campaign to influence and thereby distort reality, and that we in the press have shown remarkably little righteous indignation about it. There is a rare self-correcting discipline within the press, it seems to me, that protects readers from the abuse of access. I had access to a president once when I was working for Newsweek. Two forces, I think, kept me honest, although from time to time it is written that I must have been corrupted somehow or other. First, the resolute editors in New York who eat up the smallest detail of inside personal skinny, but who vow piously that no president could use them. Second, my opposite number at Time magazine was Hugh Sidey. He combed through everything that I wrote in Newsweek, and if he found something he felt he should have had, he camped on Pierre Salinger's desk until he exacted retribution. I remember losing access several times and resenting it. Once for 3 months, after Fletcher Knable of Look magazine had quoted me as one of the members of the press who were critical of the Kennedys, to the effect that 105% support, nothing less from the press. Another time I remember being spoken to by the candidate with disappointment, sadness, I think, about writing in a piece that Kennedy used a whitening pencil on his fingernails before deplaning from the Caroline on a campaign stop. I don't remember leaving out things that could be considered detrimental to Kennedy, although my innocence about his private life is widely disbelieved. Was Teddy ever manipulated against his will, against his best judgment? I know he felt uncomfortable about the Camelot piece in life, comparing the new frontier to King Arthur's court, but the forces behind that were just plain irresistible. I know he was late pinging to Watergate for the making of the president in 1972, but so are a lot of journalists, especially editors. I remember getting a call from Teddy in early 1973, working from the proofs of the making of the president in 1972. Almost sheepishly, he said, "Okay, Benny, tell me about Woodward and Bernstein, and make it short. Mike Bessie tells me it's costing me $1.25 a word to make changes in the galleys." Teddy White probably invested too much of his time and judgment in a Nixon victory. He understood subconsciously that Watergate, if true, would force him back to the drawing board to get the truth, and he was not ready to go back. I would like to talk tonight about the most primitive of all forms of manipulation, lying. Nothing subtle, like a TV spot suggesting that Barry Goldwater will nuke us all back to the Stone Age, or a TV spot suggesting that Mike Dukakis will flood the streets with convicted rapists. I'm not talking about exaggerating, misrepresenting, misspeaking. I'm talking about the real McCoy, lying. "Lord, Lord, how this world is given to lying," cries Falstaff in King Henry IV, and things have been going downhill ever since. In fact, lying has become just another tool for making deals, for selling beer or war, soap or candidates. It takes a certain chutzpah to talk about lying in this particular jurisdiction, where Sissel Bach quite simply owns the territory. But it seems to me that lying has reached such epidemic proportions in our culture and among our institutions in recent years that we've all become immunized to it. What the hell ever happened to righteous indignation anyway? Please forgive me for taking another whack at this subject. There isn't enough time to talk about lying in all aspects of our society. Lying on Wall Street alone is worth a special course at the business school, isn't it? Last month, 3/4 of the 25 Wall Street firms doing business with Freddie Mac, the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, had admitted to the authorities that they routinely lied to the agency to increase their chances of buying as many of the agency's securities as they want. And they were fined a routine $1 million each, $1 million paid for by the investors naturally. Routinely lie. Remember Shakespeare's line from The Winter's Tale, "Let me have no lying, it becomes none but tradesmen." And we're not talking about fly-by-night routine liars here. We're talking about Bank America, Bear Stearns, Goldman Sachs, Citicorp, Chase Manhattan, J.P. Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Kidder Peabody, Shearson Lehman, First Boston, Merrill Lynch, Payne Webber, Smith Barney, and of course the Salomon Brothers. So let's narrow the list to political lying, and to make it manageable, let's concentrate on lying by the executive branch of government. Let's concentrate on presidents. If we cannot trust our presidents, who can we trust? If our leaders lie routinely, who should we follow? Or even worse, why should we follow? President Bush ran a little photo opportunity last summer. Photo ops are lies in themselves, aren't they? To announce Judge Clarence Thomas as his nominee for the Supreme Court vacancy created by Thurgood Marshall's resignation. From his lawn at the summer White House in Kennebunkport, the president looked the press and the television camera in the eye and lied. The fact that he is black and a minority, black and a minority, has nothing to do with this sense that he is best qualified at this time, unquote. I don't know anyone in America who believes that statement to be true, either that his color had nothing to do with his appointment or that he was the best qualified. After the bloody Tiananmen Square massacre in Beijing in June of 1989, President Bush announced that all, quote, exchanges, unquote, between the U.S. and China had been banned in protest. Less than a month later, in fact, National Security Advisor Scowcroft and Deputy Secretary of State Eagleburger were in Beijing over the July 4th weekend. No national security argument for that particular lie. The Chi-Com certainly knew that Scowcroft and Eagleburger were there. Just an exercise in deceiving the American people, who had been told our outrage over Tiananmen Square made such exchanges impossible. Of course the president lied. Let's not bring up anything momentous like Ollie North's latest revelation that he is convinced that his commander-in-chief knew all about the Iran-Contra scandal from the get-go. My favorite Reagan lie was his claim that during World War II he had served as a Signal Corps photographer who had filmed the horrors of the Nazi death camps. The most complete documentation of this bizarre lie is contained in Washington Post reporter Luke Cannon's wonderful biography, President Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime, and I'm indebted to him for the details. You should read more than the title of that book. It's a wonderful book. President Reagan first told this lie to Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir during a White House meeting in November 1983. The roots of his concern for Israel could be traced to the time he photographed Nazi death camps as a Signal Corps photographer. Reagan told the Israeli Prime Minister. Afterward, he said, he had saved a copy of the death camp films for himself because he believed that the day would come when people would no longer believe that 6 million Jews had been exterminated. Years later, when a member of Reagan's family asked him if the Holocaust had actually occurred, he showed them the film, according to an article in the Israeli newspaper Mariv, known to be close to Shamir. The accuracy of the Reeves story was confirmed some months later by Dan Meridor, who was secretary to the Israeli cabinet at the time. President Reagan repeated this lie in February 1984 to Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal and Rabbi Marvin Heyer, according to both Wiesenthal and Heyer, both known for their fluency in English and their attention to detail. When Lou Cannon tried to check this story with the White House, he was told by the now Secretary of State James Baker that the president told him he never left the country in World War II and never told anyone that he did. Of course, the president lied. President James Earl Carter deserves a special place in any discussion of presidential lying, for alone among modern presidents, he made not lying a linchpin of his campaign. Who can forget that open, good old boy face telling the world, "I'll never lie to you"? Jerry Rafshoon, Carter's media maven, remembers that statement as the most consistently dramatic theme in hundreds of thousands of feet of film that he shot during the years before the formal candidacy. He was featured in the final Carter film, which Rafshoon took one day to show to Charlie Kerbo, the Bainbridge, Georgia country lawyer who was so close to Carter. "What do you think?" Rafshoon asked him. "Don't like it," Kerbo answers. "We're going to lose the liar vote." I can find no major lie on the Carter record, with the exception of a series of perhaps forgivable statements leading up to the abortive hostage rescue mission in the Iranian desert. But the record is filled with smaller lies that would make Diogenes shake his head. My source here is Stephen Brill, writing in Harper's Magazine, March 1976. "If you ever have any questions or advice for me," Carter told audiences throughout his campaign, "please write. Just put Jimmy Carter, Plains, Georgia, on the envelope and I'll get it. I open every letter myself and read them all." In fact, all mail so addressed was forwarded to Atlanta headquarters unread by the candidate. During his campaign, Carter claimed with pride to have reduced administrative costs by 50%. In fact, Carter's spending increased 50% during his first 3 years in office, and the total number of state employees increased 30%. Carter often boasted that he left Georgia with a $116 million budget surplus. In his biography, that surplus grew to $200 million. But according to the state auditor's office, Carter inherited a surplus of $90 million and left office with a surplus of $43 million, a net depletion of almost $48 million. Of course, President Carter lied, especially while he was running for office. Once in the White House, his record makes him something of a hero in this melancholy drama. That brings us backward to President Richard Milhouse Nixon, doesn't it? After a graceful leap over the accidental presidency of Jerry Ford. Where to begin? "I am not a crook" is not quite fair, though, is it? Although substantial. How about this? Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, two of the finest public servants it has been my privilege to know, unquote. But for me, the world was never quite the same after President Nixon went on national television to say that he could not tell us about Watergate because, quote, national security was involved. The toughest lie to rebut when one is out there on the cutting edge, all alone with a story we all found hard to believe in the first place. I mean, any president knows more about national security than a bunch of reporters or editors, right? And then who can forget the menu bombing of Cambodia? I bet you've all forgotten it. A neutral country in March of 1963. Menu bombing because it consisted of Operation Breakfast, Operation Lunch, Operation Dinner, Operation Snacks, and Operation Dessert. 3,630 B-52 raids on Cambodia, dropping 110,000 tons of bombs for 14 months. Never happened, said the President of the United States. Although one has to wonder there, too, about the use of national security as justification for lying. The Cambodians and the Viet Cong who were in Cambodia certainly knew about Operation Menu, and that meant the Russians and Chinese know, and in those days that's who we were trying to keep secrets from. Only the American people had to be kept in the dark. Marilyn Young, in her book, The Vietnam Wars, tells how at the first hint that this leaked to the press, Bill Beecher of the New York Times, the White House put in an ever-expanding network of illegal wiretaps to trace the leaks. She called them, and I agree with her, the first tendrils of the Watergate conspiracy and the beginning of Nixon's downfall. An embarrassment of riches faces anyone looking for a favorite LBJ anything. The larder is full of stories about this larger-than-life man lying. Did you ever hear the one about his great-great-grandfather dying at the Alamo? Doris Kearns has the definitive version of that lie in the prologue of her wonderful book, Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. Hugh Sidey had written in Time about President Johnson talking to American troops in Korea in 1966, alleging that the president had claimed that his great-great-granddaddy had fallen at the Alamo. Working on the LBJ book, Kearns had asked him about the incident. Before she even finished retelling the Sidey story, Johnson interrupted. "God damn it," he said, "why must all these journalists be such sticklers for detail? Why, they'd hold you to an accurate description of the first time you ever made love, expecting you to remember the color of the room and the shape of the windows. That's exactly what happened here. The fact is that my great-great-grandfather died at the Battle of San Jacinto, not the Alamo. Anyway, the point is that the Battle of San Jacinto was far more important to Texas history than the Alamo. Why, the men who fought there were as brave as any men who have walked the face of this earth." Kearns writes how the president went on to describe the Battle of San Jacinto for another 15 minutes. By the end of their conversation, she had heard not only that San Jacinto was the most important event in the history of Texas, but that his great-great-granddaddy had been the hero of that great and courageous moment. All of it lies. All of it lies. Kearns' investigation proved that the great-great-grandfather had not been at Alamo. He had not been at San Jacinto. He was a real estate trader who died at home in bed. Of course, President Johnson lied. And that brings us to John F. Kennedy, that marvelous man who wrapped up this country in cords of promise, hope, and confidence for a short 1,000 days. Did our friend, the friend of so many of us here tonight, did he lie too? I can't speak to the new questions being raised in such disturbing number by the revisionists about his private life. My look at the public record produces no claims to perfection in that department or in any other department. And he never got a chance to run for re-election, a time when history shows that presidential candidates are most prone to lie. But surely President Kennedy lied about Addison's disease. He had it, and he said he didn't have it. The explanation for that lie must be in the description of the disease itself. A disease caused by failure of the adrenal glands, characterized by weakness, low blood pressure, and brownish discoloration of the skin. Not exactly the words of choice for someone trying to be the first president born in the 20th century, the youngest man ever to see the office. Would he have been elected if the voters had known that truth? His mandate was 104,000 votes, I think. I don't know the answer. Maybe Teddy knows. He knew everything else about that election and the next 3 presidential elections. Are these all just little lies? Maybe petty exaggerations that slip out in the heat of political discourse and leave no mark on history? Servant who gets lied to himself and thus eventually lies to his president and to his country. That happens too, doesn't it? It sure does. In fact, it happened to the distinguished dean of this law school, Erwin Griswold, when he argued before the Supreme Court that publications of materials from the Pentagon Papers by the New York Times and the Washington Post in June of 1971 would immediately and gravely threaten the national security. Griswold told the justices that he had relied on the individuals from the State Department, the Defense Department, and the National Security Agency. 18 years later, talk about the truth emerging. 18 years later, in an unparalleled act of political courage, Dean Griswold wrote in an op-ed piece in the Post that he had, quote, never seen any trace of a threat to the national security from the publication, unquote. After he'd had a chance to read the papers for himself without relying on the word of others, quote, I indeed have never seen it even suggested that there was such an actual threat. There is massive overclassification, he continued, and the principal concern of the classifiers is not with national security, but rather with governmental embarrassment. I will leave it to the legal scholars among you tonight to figure out how much havoc Dean Griswold's 1980 sober second thoughts wreck on the 9 different Supreme Court opinions which were based on his 1971 pleadings. Maybe Washington is largely indifferent to the truth, as Les Gelb wrote in the New York Times last month. Certainly Washington is the seat of pressure applied by experts on experts. Maybe pressure is by definition selective about truth. But pressure without truth is not persuasion, but deception. What about these little dishonesties that add up to lying, but are never quite defined as lying by a society numbed beyond righteous indignation to all these little lies? Did you hear the one about the high government servant, president of an independent government agency in the Reagan administration, who was caught cheating in the finals of his hometown country club's annual member guest golf tournament? President of a Fortune 500 company before this, head of an independent agency for Reagan, and he went on to be stayed president of that agency for another 2 years into the Bush administration. It appears that one of his life's ambitions was to win this tournament, and to this end he persuaded his deputy, a scratch golfer, to be his partner. They did wonderfully well, in fact winning the 2-day event by more than 5 strokes. But just as they were leaving the locker room, all showered and shiny for the presentation of the trophies, down came the world on our high government officials' shoulders. I'm not going to name him unless he runs for office. It seems that an infraction of the rules had been observed on the 17th hole. It seems that the high government official had been observed improving his lie by kicking his ball 7 feet out of the rough into the fairway. The trophy ceremony was canceled. The runners-up were declared the winners. The cheater was suspended from club membership for 2 years, but declared eligible for readmission if he went to a psychiatrist in Washington for treatment. He did just that and stayed on the job through the first 2 years of the Bush administration. Just a petty deception? Just a little lie of little consequence? I hope lies will never not matter, but let me answer these questions this way. If you were the admissions officer of Harvard College, would you accept a student who boasted that his great-granddaddy died a war hero at the Alamo when you knew he died at home in bed? If you were chairman of the search committee looking for a new president of a great university, how would you feel about a man who told you how moved he had been by the sight of Nazi death camps when he was taking pictures of them, when you knew he had never left the country during World War II? If you were president of Harvard and you were looking for dean of the Kennedy School, how would you feel about a Princeton graduate who had been suspended from his country club for lying about his lie? The trouble with overlooking little lies is the damage done to reverence for truth. If the truth is not revered, there is no conscience, there is no compass. And without a compass, a man gets lost. A country gets lost. Just look at Vietnam. The man who couldn't tell the truth about his great-great-granddaddy felt no compunction about lying in January 1964 about how American soldiers were doing in Vietnam. In December '63, Bob McNamara, at the end of his first fact-finding trip to Vietnam for the new president, held a press conference at Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon. He told an anxious nation that he was, quote, optimistic as to the progress that had been made and can be made during the coming years in the fight against the VC. Landing at Andrews Air Force Base the next day, McNamara told another press conference, quote, "We have every reason to believe that U.S. military plans for 64 will be successful." Both statements were lies. A chopper trip to the Oval Office later, the Secretary of Defense told the President the truth, a truth the world didn't learn until 7 years later, again from the oft-cited but rarely read Pentagon Papers. In fact, McNamara told the President he returned from Vietnam, quote, "laden with gloom," unquote. Viet Cong progress had been, quote, "great," unquote. My best guess being that the situation has in fact been deteriorating to a far greater degree than we realize. The situation is very disturbing. Johnson repeated the McNamara press conference statements a couple of weeks later. Don't tell me that lies are ever little. Think for a minute how history might have changed if these lies had been left untold and if the secret truth had been publicly stated. Only a few months later, the world learned about the Battle of Tonkin Gulf. Listen to this from the Time magazine issue of August 14th, 1964. Through the darkness from the west and south, the intruders boldly sped. There were at least 6 of them, Russian-designed Swatow gunboats armed with 37mm and 28mm guns and P-4s. At 9:52, they opened fire on the destroyers with automatic weapons, this time from as close as 2,000 yards. The night glowed eerily with the nightmarish glare of airdropped flares and boat searchlights. 2 of the enemy boats went down. That's the kind of vivid detail the news magazines have made famous. Only one trouble. There was no battle. Not a single intruder. Never mind 6 Russian-designed Swatow gunboats. They never opened fire. They never sank. They never fired torpedoes. They never were. Even President Johnson privately repudiated the existence of this battle. Quote, "Hell, those dumb, stupid sailors were just shooting at flying fish." Quote, the commander-in-chief was quoted as saying, according to Stanley Carno's Vietnam, A History. Johnson's irreverent observation was confirmed many, many years later by an eyewitness, Vice Admiral, then Commander Jim Stockdale, flying over the U.S. destroyers Maddox and Turner Joy in a Skyhawk jet fighter. He scoured the seas for more than 2 hours. He is as sure as a man can be that the destroyers were shooting at phantom blips on their radar screens. There were no PT boats. There was no battle. But all this didn't become known until Stockdale survived 7 years in a Viet Cong prison and wrote his version of the truth. There can be no one who thinks that that lie was an inconsequential little lie. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution was passed overwhelmingly by Congress because of that lie. And the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was the justification for the U.S. war effort in Vietnam for years to come. Sooner or later in any exploration of lying, it is appropriate, if unpleasant, to face the fact that newspapers sometimes lie. I know more about this than I wish I knew. The newspaper lie that I will take to my grave was Janet Cook's story in the Washington Post about an 8-year-old heroin addict named Jimmy. It was one hell of a story. She won a Pulitzer Prize for it, as a matter of fact, but she made it up. There was no 8-year-old heroin addict named Jimmy. For reasons I still don't understand, she made him up out of whole cloth. Newspapers generally lie because people lie to them, either purposely or, as we have discussed, or accidentally when our sources really don't know the truth. The great Walter Lippmann, writing more than 50 years ago, was understanding about this misinformation. The truth is not there to be seized at one piece at one time. The truth emerges, and that's how it's supposed to be in a democracy. But the Janet Cook variety lie must be dealt with head-on. In our case, with a front-page story followed by a 10,000-word investigation of how the whole sorry mess happened, warts and all. Politicians rarely risk that kind of mea culpa. Perhaps, although there have been a few lately, haven't there? Perhaps because publishers are notoriously more understanding than voters. In fact, admissions of frailty by newspapers is an arcane discipline variously called corrections, clarifications, amplifications, editor's notes, or the dreaded A word, apology. The best newspapers are now reasonably comfortable in the confessional, generally collecting the day's errata on page 2 or 3. If a mistake is so important that it must be run on page 1, it is never called a correction or any other euphemism for wrongdoing. It is simply presented as a story, and you must be smart enough to know that this information is there to set the record straight. And don't ask me why. On the wall in front of my computer, I have scotch-taped the following front-page piece from the Sunday Times of London, July 13, 1986, and as an example of an editor's nightmare. Today's magazine of a company called Control Risks, CR, I'm quoting, contains statements which are untrue. Contrary to what is stated, at no time has CR paid or been an agent for paying £2 million to the IRA, nor any sum to any terrorist organization. Nor was CR involved in or aware of the alleged attempt to smuggle £300,000 into Ireland. CR is not persona non grata with the Home Office and the police. The statement that CR's activities often bring it into direct conflict with local police is also untrue. We accept that CR always cooperates with the police and enjoys their confidence around the world. We unreservedly apologize to CR for the above errors and have agreed to pay a substantial sum in damage to the charities of its choice. That is known in my trade as a running front 3.5 grovel with full twist, and to be avoided at all costs by editors who seek seniority. I have closed on a lighter note for fear that this long discussion of lies will take the joy out of this occasion, just as I feel that lying has taken much of the joy out of Washington and the business that Teddy White and I and so many of you found so joyously rewarding. There was no one who epitomized the great joy to be found in our business more than Teddy. The great joy to be found in the search for truth, in shining pure light on that truth, and spreading understanding on this troubled, restless, and magic land. Thank you very much.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. There are a couple of microphones set up, 2 up there and 2 down here. And if you'd like to ask Ben Bradley a question, please come to the microphone, keep your question brief, and Ben will keep his answer reasonably brief as well. So we will start right here and then go up into the balcony. You, please.
Thank you. Mr. Bradley, I'd like to ask you about another liar running for office in Louisiana on Saturday. I noticed in another newspaper that the New York Times argues that the biggest danger David Duke represents is in bringing racism into the mainstream of American political discourse. I wonder whether you think that's true, whether you would hold President Bush at least partly responsible, and what you would do to reverse that trend.
Well, I think that, I don't know if you can't really blame Bush for, it's hard to blame Bush for Duke. But I think race it's just so magnified now. It's much more important than it's being given credit for, if that's a credit. I mean, I know what I do. I do what those bumper stickers tell you to do. Vote for the crook. Vote for Edwards. He's better than the other guy. But I think, there's plenty of blame for George Bush. I think I'd give him a pass on Duke.
Okay, thank you. Question in the
about Walter Lippmann. A few years ago, Walter Lippmann A few years ago, I talked to Jan Karski, one of the heroes of the Polish resistance, a mile away from here. He told me in detail how, when he visited the death camp of Belsen, at great risk to his life, was smuggled in the ghetto, he was asked by the Jewish leaders to contact some famous Jews in America to tell about the destruction of the Jews. He met with Walter Lippmann. He told them what he was asked to tell, and his eyewitness report, Walter Lippmann never wrote a word. And I wanted to ask you about the responsibility of journalists and how do you explain Walter Lippmann's behavior?
I can't explain it. He was conflicted about his faith, and that's a fact.
This was a question of reporting facts, not stating his Jewish faith.
Yes, I know that, but it would have, he obviously must have thought about it. I'd never heard this incident, but the record is filled with evasions that he took. This great man took. He did it.
Did you want to ask a question standing there? Okay, please.
Just quickly, I wondered if you believe that the Pentagon's control of the Gulf War coverage constitutes a lie. Secondly, do you think that what happened with Peter Arnett and Bob Simon's attempts to get independent reporting will make it more difficult, less difficult, more likely, less likely that future coverage will be similarly controlled?
Well, I don't think it amounted to a lie, because they didn't. I mean, they told us they were out to screw us from the beginning, so there was no lying involved. However, they forced newspapers to write many lies. I mean, it was the most frustrating moment of I can remember for years. You know, thousands of man-hours spent planning coverage, never mind thousands of dollars. The Post had 6 people there, one with each of the 4 main attack units, and they went out, and boy, were we ready, and we didn't file a damn thing. Neither one of them, none of them filed anything for 3 days. I think Arnett and, Simon, I think, not Arnett so much, but Simon's problems became as a result of his feeling censored and feeling that he wasn't doing his job. So in that sense, I mean, I suppose it was his fault because he did it, but the Pentagon caused it. Arnett, he had a free choice, and he did it. There's only one I mean, I don't think we can stand that again, and I don't know what to do about it. We're in negotiations with these people. I have one bit of optimism that sure as God made green apples, that was going to end in a few days if the war had continued. As soon, I mean, it just was. And technology may save us all, because the little phones now are such that you're going to be able to dial the city desk of any newspaper in the world from out there. And if they're going to try to censor those, that'll be ridiculous.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
That was going to be my question, too. But I would like to, I heard we had a young man who was in the at the Gulf at that particular time, and he made the remark that if Hussein had allowed them to go into Iraq, then it would have been a much different story. They would have had better coverage, and we would have known how many people were hurt at that particular time. Give us some more thoughts on that.
Well, I don't even know that now. I don't know that now. Every week I read a story saying that umpteen more people were killed by friendly fire. I have no idea of what's going on inside of Iraq. The funny part about it is what I don't really understand. I really don't. The press corps and the military are the most natural friends. I never knew a reporter who went to Vietnam who didn't come back with increased respect for the military. And I never knew a military man who sat down with a reporter, be it in the Delta or wherever it was in Vietnam, who didn't come back with increased respect for the journalists. But it's the guy who's next in line for promotion. He gets so scared that there will be something controversial come out, and there's only one way to fix it, and that is to keep it out.
Charles?
Charles, how are you, sir?
How are you, Ben? I agree with a great deal of what you said, most of what you said. And I think you know that I think you're one of the distinguished journalists of the generation.
But
I think to some extent you've begged the question. Let's say you are sitting in the Oval Office, you're President of the United States. Now, quite obviously, we're not talking about telling a lie or shading the truth with respect to national defense, but we're talking about other issues, domestic issues, things that are very important to you and me and everybody else. Under these circumstances, do you think that at times a president should not tell the whole truth to the American people? And if you say no, he should always do it, then that's the end of it. But if you say, well, at times maybe he should, then under what circumstances should he do that in the public interest as he might see it and as many of us might see it?
well, there's a third alternative. As the former editor of the Saturday Evening Post once said, the wisdom of the ages cries out for silence. What's the matter with that?
No. When you guys
Just
in the
don't
press,
talk.
when you guys in the press get in there, you and Al Hunt,
Keep
and all
them
the
out
rest
of there if you want to. Don't I never quote me on that, but why? I mean, why? If you were planning the rescue of the hostages, why do you have to have lunch with Al
I'm not
Hunt?
talking about that. I'm talking about domestic issues.
What?
I'm talking about domestic issues when he is being pounded and attempts to get a president, either party, nonpartisan, to say something that will damage him politically and maybe the country.
Well, who's he say it to, Charles? That's what I don't understand. Why can't he say that to you? If you're lucky to get in, you don't have to talk.
Then he should always tell the complete crystal truth.
I think he should shut up. Half of the time he should shut up. And I think there is, when I first started out, let me just tell you a story about how I learned how to shut up once, although you don't think I did. But I was a press officer, a press attaché in the embassy in Paris. And there was an old, at time of Blair Clark, you will remember him, called Harold King, who was very close to de Gaulle, who was then in exile still. And he had a black Homburg hat. And he came in and he put his hat on, his cane, hands on that, and he'd ask you a question. And you would, you'd give some evasive answer that you've been trained to by the diplomats. And he'd sit there, and he'd just pound his cane like this. And it was so embarrassing that it just, you said a little more. And when you got through with that bite of it, and he still wasn't satisfied, he'd pound it again. And before long, just by pounding, he had it all out. And it took me about a year to learn just to sit there. You feel foolish, but it's a great useful offensive weapon. And you said, of course, we're all disagreed about if it involves national security. I have severe reservations about that. Just because George Bush tells me it involves national security, or Richard Nixon, I don't believe it. In fact, if he has to say it, I think I'm almost come out against it. But try it sometime. I sat next to somebody at dinner the other night, and we decided we'd try to see if we could get through the evening without telling a lie. Not a goddamn lie. We weren't going to tell anything. And there were a lot of long pauses in the conversation. And sometimes the long pause came after one person said something, and the other person looked. It's so ingrained in our society. It's not important anymore. This is what I'm trying to bring out. I think that, obviously you wouldn't, the way it used to get posed to us was you wouldn't publish the sailing times of the troop ships. Well, that's an emotional way of expressing it, but they don't leave by ship most of the time now. And it's no question of that. Didn't satisfy you, didn't it? Yes?
Mr. Bradley, how good a job are today's journalists doing in rooting out lies, and what can they do better?
Well, they're doing a good enough job so that I gave you a few cases of them. Those are the lies we know about. I'm not depressed by the state of journalism, as some of my colleagues are. I think that journalists today are terrific. I think the papers are much better than they used to be. They're much more complete. They're much more educated. Reporters now are apt to have had graduate degrees in the subjects that they're writing about. They're apt to know just as much as some of the Assistant Secretary of States or Defense who used to be selling cars out there somewhere in the Midwest. They're very good. Now, what is our role? I mean, our role is really to look for the truth and print it. Are we doing a good job in rooting out lies? Garbage in, garbage out. If they lie to us for the first bite, we're going to lie back to you. But I think I'm hoping that it's. I think that we've got to try to improve that and try to root it out and try to make a lie expensive. I don't know if we can.
Beth?
That's sort of the question I was going to ask, but I want to put it in a different way. A lot of people allege that the press has become very conservative in light of the fact that money has become a much more important part of the news business. That potentially an investigative report could cost a newspaper or a television network quite a lot of money. Do you think that money really has a more important role in the news business than it did a few years ago, and is that enabling politicians to get away with more?
I don't know. I'm not the right person to ask. I've never been told that anything that we have planned to write or have written is going to cost us a nickel. I think reporters are more conservative than the previous generation, and I think there's a very good reason for that. They get paid a hell of a lot better. It's hard to be conservative on $75 a week, but 75 grand, you begin to think of the kids and the bank account and the IRA and roll it over and all this stuff.
Two more questions. One in the balcony and then. Yeah.
Mr. Bradley, I was wondering your opinion about allegations that were made in the book Silent Coup last summer about Bob Woodward being possibly used or manipulated by his sources.
Garbage. Sorry. What was the question? Well, there was a book called The Silent Crew who said that Bernstein here was a crook and Woodward was a CIA agent. God knows what I was. It's really garbage.
Last question, Gail.
We might as well.
No, over here.
Hi.
Hi, yes. Just want to sort of perhaps take a little bit of a broader approach, although that's unfair. You didn't come to give some broad talk. But I wonder if in some ways you're focusing on lying and the little lie and the sort of, knowing laughter we all share when you tell the stories that we all recognize as lies doesn't sort of help us avoid the sort of difficulty in identifying what is truth. I mean, one of the problems, it seems to me, is that to the extent that lying is the shadow, as it were, of the truth, the problem becomes sort of implicit in that is a sense that there is, in fact, a truth to be known. And I think that, in fact, I think no one would agree with that there is no absolute truth, and that it then becomes the responsibility of each individual to sort of question their own perceptions of reality and their own perceptions of fact, which are then a reflection of their own value system, and the sharing of certain values shaping the perception of what is truth against which one is measuring a lie or not. And I guess my biggest problem with even the sort of laughter that we have about your identification of the lying is that it ultimately relieves all of us of the responsibility for examining our perception of the facts that are constituting the truth in the first place, and that it becomes too easy to sort of avoid dealing with the kind of difficulty of coping with what truth really is and searching harder to find out what it is that is truth before you make a judgment about what lying is.
I mean, what is truth is why I'm in this business. That's why I majored in Greek at this great university, classical Greek under John Finley. I don't know the answer, and you're dead right. We don't know what the truth is, but we do. It does emerge. It really does, and I'm not talking about. I don't know the truth in Iran-Contra. I wish to God I did, and I've been involved with many hours of trying to find it. I know that it's a worthy chase, and it seems to me the chase is everything. That's a reason to come to work. Just chase it down. See if you can get it. See if you know a little more tonight than you did this morning. And the subjects, you'll have plenty of subjects. You know, you'll have to assign them priorities and then go after them. I don't know everything yet about the SNLs. I don't know everything about, you know, and I think the press did a lousy job in the SNLs. Lousy job. We did a lousy job about covering the housing scandals. But pretty soon, if you admit this often enough, you're coming up with an odd definition of a journalist, that we are the policemen. And, you know, I think we are the reinforcements sometimes. And we are the people who are supposed to oversee the, take a look at that, oversee the enforcers. But it's not our job to go around and arrest people, to even draft indictments. But I mean, I don't feel uncomfortable that I don't know the truth, as long as I've said I don't know it, and as long as I've tried to find it out.
Well, I guess it's in that very act. I gather it's, to me, I worry about the presumptuousness of trying to find it out, because it doesn't mean that you stop and look at the values you're bringing to those perceptions. I mean, this is why I said it's sort of a larger, deeper issue, but it seems to me that one of the problems...
But that would cripple you if you sat there in your chair and said, my God, should I do this? Should I ask it? I mean, is he telling the truth? You've got to have a gut instinct, and you've got to say to yourself, it doesn't sound right to me.
Then what about the
what?
There are some lies that are very easy to recognize.
Well, I agree. I agree.
What about the press as a truth squad? You were talking about your discomfort at the idea of the press being the police in politics.
Well, I mean, we're not enforcers in that sense. I think we have a perfect right to and a duty to find out as best we can with all the limits that are placed on us. I mean, we've only got a few hours and a few, you know, thousands of bucks to throw at it. And we're going to have to quit and write it. But, I mean, I don't think that we have to go into the Boston City Housing Commission to see how, you know, what if there is such a thing, to see how good they're doing it, how well they're behaving. That isn't our function. But if some major figure in a community or in a country looks at you and says something, and there's a little tilt light that goes off in your head, and I said, I'm not sure that's right. I think I'll just take a look at that. Then I think, I mean, the First Amendment, that's a cinch. That gives us our right to do that. Thank you all.
Thanks for the sunlight that went out there. We appreciate it. Thank you. Ben, thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for being with us. Good night. Thank you very much.